This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine. As always, housekeeping, if you are listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, we urge you to follow us, watching us on our YouTube channel. There is a subscribe button below. There is a button to the right. If you smash that thing, you'll get an update each and every time we upload a new version of this vodcast series, E&P Reports. I am joined with two fellow Floridians today, but I'm taking you most of you know I come from the Tampa Bay area. I'm going to take you northeast up into the Jacksonville, Florida area, where we're greeting to our panel today, or we're saying hey to Andrew Pantazi. Is that correct, sir?
That's right, Mike.
Andrew Pantazi. Andrew, you and I have never met, but you were working the Times Union when they were a customer of mine back in my consulting days. But you were on the editorial side, and I was always doing sales consulting. Were you in the big building next to the river?
So the newsroom actually was in a dungeon-like building that was hidden away from the big building, but there was a hallway that connected us. So we were always in this concrete block building where we got to use all of our newspapers to soak up the rain whenever it rained, which in Florida is often. So the hallways were always lined with newspapers that were frequently damp. So it was a typical I think Florida newsroom experience. Is
this why you were the fly in the ointment, the union organizer? You got sick of laying all those newspapers around, and you said, "I'm going to get this, and I'm going to help." So we're going to get this union going. Was that one of the reasons, or is
no? I considered that to be an amenity. There were many other reasons.
Deirdre Conner. Good to have you with us as well. You're living in Jacksonville. I'm mentioning the fact I haven't introduced you, but what these people's new title is. Deirdre, you spent some time at the Times Union as well, right? Before you went off and worked in the nonprofit world in Jacksonville, correct?
Yes, that's right. I worked in that same building, affectionately known as the production building, which I do believe was the site of a film at one point, because the basement was very picturesque.
Well, both of you have left the basement of the Jacksonville Times Union through a couple owners, based on when I'm looking at your backgrounds, and jointly have started, almost 2 years old, the Jacksonville Tributary, a nonprofit news entity. And if you look at the masthead of the Tributary, it says a Northeast Florida journalism collective. We're going to be exploring the Tributary nonprofit journalism and how it's gone over the last couple of years, right after this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
All right, let's start with you, Andrew. You left the Times Union knowing you were going to start the Tributary. Did you leave the Times Union and then try to find a new gig? Give us the history of why you left the Times Union, which at the time was owned by Gannett, correct? This was after the sale. What's the story, the timeline, and how did the Tributary come about?
Yeah, so Mike, I'm a Jacksonville native. I'm from the area. I worked at the Times Union for about 8 years. It was a dream to come home and work for my hometown paper. My wife and I are both from here. We're raising our kids here. Both sets of our parents are from here. And so it was important to me to come back and be a journalist in my hometown. Being at the paper, when I started there back, February of 2013, we had over 100 people in the newsroom. Not an uncommon story, but by the time I left, there were 22 people remaining. And that includes like the part-time agate clerk. That includes everybody, management, non-management, who were at the paper when I left. And I left taking a buyout. I had been talking actually with Deirdre and some others off and on for about 3 years about, somebody should do something, which I think a typical story for a lot of newsroom workers, the idea that somebody should buy the paper, somebody should do something to, reinvigorate, since we had been purchased by then Gatehouse, which became Gannett, and we saw these steep cuts. Over the course of the pandemic, we were meeting more regularly, having Zoom conversations, and then when it was safe to do so, meeting outside and talking more about what would this look like, and especially the idea of why I no longer thought it was a smart idea to buy the newspaper rather than pour whatever money would be spent on trying to buy the newspaper anyway into starting something new and what you could accomplish with that. Still throughout much of, that first year of 2020, it was, I thought somebody else should be doing this. As I spent more time researching and building business plans, I became more convinced that what can look like a panacea to a lot of people on the outside looking in, starting a nonprofit news organization, really depends on what you actually do with it. And I was more convinced that I should be the one to actually execute this. I felt like I had strong opinions on how a nonprofit newsroom should operate. So when they offered the buyout, it was earlier than I expected I would leave, but I figured this is an opportunity for me to get some severance, some cushion, while I tried to start this organization. After I took the buyout, before I even announced it, I actually got scooped on my own buyout. The local TV did a story about me and a couple others taking the buyout. And I say it felt like Huck Finn dangling in the rafters watching his own funeral, because I was getting all these text messages from people saying either we're going to miss you in Jacksonville or we're going to miss you in journalism, or, variations of that. And I was still employed by Gannett at that time. I was not ready to announce. So I tried to just quickly, I put together a Substack and I said, look, more details to come, but if you want to subsidize my lifestyle while we're putting this together, feel free. And we got about 200 people who became monthly or annual subscribers to the Substack, with the understanding that this is just them supporting the idea that a nonprofit news organization will later launch. And so from that, it was a much larger response than I expected. So we kind of use that newsletter as a pre-launch tool of, hey, here's some stories to like keep the audience growing pre-launch. And then we launched about a year ago. It was around late July that we started regularly publishing on our own website.
So even though it was 2020 when you started the nonprofit entity, December 2020, if I'm correct, there was still a gap before you started providing the news. You just had a lot of energy that was, percolating. As people said, we can't wait to see this new news entity start. And that was just, I guess they were just giving you a leap of faith, right? And supporting you?
Yeah. I think it was really encouraging to see the trust that people had in me just through readers who had been following my work. It also, for me, we did not file in December, so I left in December, but I wanted to do my due diligence of recruiting a board, putting together,
right.
What will this look like? Rather, one of my strong feelings in starting a nonprofit news organization is that I see some nonprofit news websites that seem to replicate for-profit news organizations in everything except tax status. Part of being a nonprofit is that nobody owns it. I don't own it. It is something that belongs to the public, and the board is responsible for it. So I wanted to actually do the work of, how do I recruit a board that has a vision that aligns with mine, but allow them to also have a say in what is this going to look like? So as we put together our bylaws, as we put together our tax application to the IRS. So we filed for incorporation in late April, filed with the IRS for tax exempt status at the beginning of May. I will say I regret waiting that long because I did not realize just how long it takes the IRS to get to those applications. And it took them until near the end of October to get back to us to approve our status, which meant we were doing a lot of fundraising meetings where we weren't actually collecting checks from people because we were awaiting that IRS response. And as you probably know, time kills deals. And so I think we lost a lot of momentum in having to wait so long to get back to people before we could say, hey,
but even then, I mean, there's nothing wrong with hitting the community with a concept and trying to stay top of mind. Though I assume here comes Deirdre. I mean, because Deirdre, you have ink in your veins, if I use that overused metaphor, but you came out of the journalistic industry. You were part of a newsroom, but you left to get into the nonprofit world of Jacksonville, correct? I mean, that means you were wired in to philanthropy, in local philanthropy in the Jacksonville area. Do I have that correct, Deirdre?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm coming up on 10 years in the nonprofit sector.
Okay, so I mean, but you knew Andrew, or just tell me how this all kind of came together. I mean, what were you doing and why did this intrigue you? Because now you are the chairman of the board of the Tributary. So just give me a little background and color on this, if you don't mind.
Sure, Mike. So I left the Florida Times Union to work in nonprofits in 2011. So it's actually been more than 10 years. And really, I think it felt very natural progression for me. I mean, to some extent, it was due to the economic conditions, wanting to make sure that our family was diversified, as my husband was also a journalist. And but really believing that there's a lot of different ways to empower the community with sources of accurate information and connections to sort of civic infrastructure. And so that's a lot of what I've been doing since then. And really, I think I still definitely remember when Andrew reached out to me because we did overlap at the Times Union to some extent, saying like, hey, can we get lunch? And we talked and really I think when it comes right down to it, nonprofits exist when there's a market failure, when capitalism really can't fix a problem, whether that be nonprofit hospitals, whether that be nonprofit food banks. And so what we have now in this industry is just a colossal shift in how it's supported from a business side. And what's really exciting to me about the nonprofit news sector is there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of looking for new solutions to a problem that nobody has fully figured out, but that is most certainly essential to democracy, both on the local level and the national level. We've looked at a lot of research on the role of local news in everything from political polarization to government corruption. And so to me, it was just very exciting to be a part of that. And also, I should mention, I'm a volunteer, and I think the role of volunteers in all nonprofit organizations is really, really important. And so we have an incredible board of directors for the Tributary of volunteers who range from people who are currently in journalism to folks who are in technology, and sort of a wide range of individuals who really believe that accessible news for our community is absolutely vital.
All right, now this is not a new concept, and I want to take this, if I may, our 30 to 40 minutes together in 3 stages. So I'm going to stay back at the evolution first before we get into the actual physical culture of the new entity, because many people, Andrew, right now are you, if you know what I mean. They're in a newsroom, or they're leaving a newsroom, or they just left a newsroom. And let's be honest, Andrew, you didn't get into this industry to get rich, right? You had a passion for journalism. I mean, I checked your background. Am I correct?
Yeah.
I mean, a passion to bring truth, be that final check on power in a Madisonian democracy. I'm not trying to butter you up, but I mean, no, I don't think anyone goes, I'm going to be a journalist to get rich, right? I mean, you had a passion for this. You became disillusioned, like many are in the industry, due to corporate downsizing, hedge funds. I'm not going to put down Gannett right now. We all know what they're doing. You said first you wanted to take a whack at buying the Times Union. Did you even approach them with a price? Because to my knowledge, Gannett's model was to pick up everything they could, then, and pair off the little guys and just hold on to the metros, the major papers, in hopes to have a digital presence. At least that's what I've read between the lines and seen in the few interviews with senior management. Did you have a dialogue Or was that just something you were thinking of doing? I'm just curious.
Those more early conversations I was having with people like Deirdre and other people, before, a lot of the people who can connect you to the people, where it was, would there be interest from these people? And here's, looking at what Gannett's purchase was, which was they purchased the Times Union's chain, Morris Communications, and they said it was 3.5 to 4.5 times EBITDA. When they purchased Gatehouse, or when Gatehouse purchased Gannett, I should say, and they got their financing, they went to shareholders and they
when Gatehouse purchased Morris, it was 4.5 was the multiple.
It was 3.5 to 4.5 between there. And then when they purchased Gannett, Gatehouse put to shareholders a case study, which included the Morris chain, which said what they claimed the EBITDA had increased by. And so you could do some back of the envelope math on if they would be willing to sell at the same rate of 3.5 to 4.5 times, and they're claiming EBITDA has increased by this much, here's how much they would value the paper at.
Of course, you did the math and the multiples. How about the, the Jacksonville Times Union organization was kind of a center of an orbit. St. Augustine, right? A few weeklies and some other publications. Was any of that your concern first, or you wanted the Metro? That's where you thought your news initiative was going to be. I'm just curious. Did you look at maybe peeling off something else of their empire then?
No, it was just the Times Union. It's Florida's oldest newspaper, and so there's a lot of emotional attachment that I and many other people have to this newspaper that's been around for so long, since the mid 1800s.
Do you still okay? So then, as you're leaving, you took your out. It became public knowledge that you were going to start a nonprofit journalistic entity. Did it have a name to that yet? Or was it just, this is Andrew's thing? I'm curious. Andrew?
No, we had, in the meetings I was having with Deirdre and other people who I was seeking advice from and who were really helpful, I'd come up with a name early on.
Okay.
I really liked the Tributary because part of what we're trying to do is to really think about, the media landscape as an ecosystem and what's missing from here. Seeing the value of, I think local TV still does great breaking news, live breaking news, seeing that we have 2 business niche publications that cover, a business journal and then a daily record that does legal and business news. We have the newspaper still covering City Hall really well, but seeing the missing,
enterprise journalism, piece, investigative reporting.
The really expensive type of stuff that requires long-term work and requires a lot of public records that, as Deirdre said, the market can't sustain. The market can sustain certain types of journalism, I believe. Other types are the nice to haves that everything else is subsidizing. And this is the type of work that would be subsidized by a functioning for-profit newspaper, but they're not functioning well enough to subsidize it. So the Tributary, referring to that media ecosystem. Also, I liked that it's shortened to the Trib, which is a newspaper name, going back to right. Tribune. And so I thought there was a nice play on words there to
and I love your URL is, correct me if I'm wrong, your URL is Jack's Trib, right?
That's right.
JAXTRIB. That's great. I mean, that because everybody knows JAX is Jacksonville, especially that's your 3 letters of your airport. I mean, okay.
Can I just add one thing to what Andrew
just about to say, Deirdre? Add to that. Go
ahead. I think what is really, really important, particularly here, is we have a really collaborative journalism community. And I know going back to even when I was at the paper, there was a lot of, I think, collaboration and interest in helping each other in the media ecosystem, probably more so than I've seen in other markets where I've worked. And another really important thing about the Tributary is it's designed to supplement, not to replace what is already going great. I think I've seen from what we've studied in other communities that there have been communities where newer nonprofit news outlets have even said explicitly, like, we're here to put everybody else out of business, or we're here to replace the newspaper. That is not in any way what the Tributary is about. We're really to complement and fill in, like Andrew said, holes in the ecosystem. The fact is that there are journalists still working in Jacksonville who are doing absolutely heroic things. But as Andrew said, there's just not enough of them. And so this is a way of innovating in the environment and adding back just even honestly a fraction of what has been lost in terms of the community's capacity for local news and like critical information needs, as some of the researchers would put it.
You've got. Let me just read this paragraph now to our audience, because I went to your website. Here's what it says. The Tributary is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom designed to collaborate with existing local media. And I love that, because what you just said, back that up, Deirdre, we complement existing local news by focusing on underreported topics. And then you actually list redistricting, children's issues, infrastructure. You actually even you're building a maps and ways to show the community, doing the deep dives into some of the challenges that other newsrooms may not have the resources to cover. But correct me if I'm wrong, you don't charge anyone for your content, right? If a news outlet picks up your story, you applaud them, correct, Andrew?
Yeah, so for example, one of the Black newspapers in town runs almost all of our stories in print, which has been really helpful to them to provide content that they need. One of the public radio stations in our area publishes almost all of our stories online as well. And, the idea, it also helps our business model when we go to, philanthropists and we're saying, look, we're able to get the largest audience possible because people aren't just getting this from our website. They're getting this from where they already consume the news. So this is using like the existing structures that are in place. We don't need to build from scratch a whole audience that needs to be, 100,000 people if we're using the audiences that already exist at other media outlets. And then one of the TV stations we've closely partnered with repeatedly on our bigger stories. And TV has an audience that is much larger than the newspaper here locally. And so that's been really nice to be able to tap into what's also a much more diverse, more working class type of audience.
And I'm assuming that they all point back to you and your brand, thus building your top of mind awareness in Jacksonville and hopefully your private donations. So let's get into the business then before we get into the people. How's it going, guys? I mean, are you getting paid, Andrew? Are you paying your bills?
Yes. Yeah. Once we got our IRS approval in October, we were able to deposit some checks and I went on payroll and we're doing really well. We've got enough cash on hand now that we're able to hire a new position. And so we've got that posted. And
okay, wait, I want to read that position in a second, because that's what got Neiman all over you. So that's how we found you in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to that now. You actually call yourself a Democratic newsroom. I love that term. And you're doing something really far-fetched. You're saying to a journalist that works for you, and by the way, you even put the salary up there. You're offering $70K and benefits for a full-time reporter. Is that correct in Jacksonville?
That's right.
How does that compare? Wait a second. Let me ask the question. You came out of the other place recently. How does that compare to some of the people on the other side right now? Is that a decent living?
I think this would be near the top. This would be near the top for the other newsroom for non-management.
And you call your newsroom a Democratic newsroom, meaning this enterprise reporter you're hiring has the right to tell you, I don't want to cover this story. If you edit me, I want to know in advance. Am I correct? And I want to approve the final story that gets posted. Am I saying that correctly, sir?
Yeah, so it's saying that, we're hiring someone at a high rate because we're expecting to hire someone who we can trust to be basically a partner in this. And so it's beyond even just the story assignments where they have that independence. Now, every story needs to be edited. We're not saying you get to decide. It's more a veto than I get to post whatever I want on the website. But it does also mean, for example, full transparency in the budget, that they can see how much cash on hand we have, that they can participate in, we put together a budget recommendation that we submit to the board. The board independently sets the budget, but, we're able to have all of the workers that we eventually hire are participating in that process. So they can say,
you have to understand now, Andrew, how anti-establishment what you just said is. And I'm not going to mention companies, but we put out a story in the last few months about a media company that was bragging about how much money they were making with a specific digital initiative. Do you follow? They put the dollar up there, and then we were asked to take it down because they're in union negotiations. They don't want the employees to know that something's making money as they bargain to pay less salaries. Do you understand? If this was McCarthyism era, you would be right now in front of Congress being called a communist. Do you understand?
So, Mike, I think, yes, I think it is unusual in the for-profit industry, but in nonprofits,
it's very common.
What Andrew's describing is very common, which is it's a collaborative, for the organization that I work for, all of our staff members are involved in budget development. We don't call ourselves a democratic workplace, by the way. It's just that is part of what we all contribute to, the direction of the organization. We are going to have a staff retreat tomorrow. We're going to talk about hey, what are we going to do for the next few years and things like that. So while that may be uncommon in sort of the traditional for-profit news environment, I think it's actually fairly common in the nonprofit sector. It's just that the news industry and the nonprofit sector are very new to each other. And like you said, it's exploding. There's more and more organizations who are becoming nonprofit news outlets, but that was not super, super common until relatively recently. I think if you look at INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, they've shown their membership growth exploding and things like that. So I want to say I think what Andrew's describing here is not super outside the norm for nonprofits, and of course nonprofits are not unilateral either, right? There's a lot of different ways to run a nonprofit and there's no one perfect way, but No,
I think it's fascinating, but I mean, a day is going to come where Andrew says we're going to have to buy another computer, and someone says, "Well, wait a second, I asked for a raise in pay. You're going to have to operate the newsroom accordingly," right? I mean, just that everybody has some kind of a voice in how the decisions are made for P&L, right, Andrew? And there's nothing wrong with that. Sounds a little, different than a normal. Shareholders have to make profit, the heck with the worker, but I don't want to get into all those things. Here's another aspect I want to bring up to you guys, just for your opinion. And by no means am I judging you, because I think what you're doing is amazing. And I believe that there is a news desert can be defined a number of different ways. Do you agree, Andrew?
Yes.
I mean, the fact that there's a news desert in Jacksonville, some would say, no, there's already television there, and there's two business pubs, and even though we have a downsized newsroom at the Times Union, there's still news being reported. There's still a check on power. Don't do this in Jacksonville. Do this in Altoona. You see what I'm saying? Where there is some discussion now that nonprofits are flourishing in affluent communities that already have news, but the desert you're filling is enterprise reporting. You're saying, correct? Real investigative journalism, and this is what I find fascinating. Deirdre, you actually said, in your humble opinion, and someone who comes from both nonprofit and news, that it's hard to fund that in a for-profit environment. Correct, Deirdre? In your opinion, nonprofit might be the best way to have investigative journalism survive on all levels. Is that what you're saying?
I hesitate from saying best or because this is just a problem with a capital P that everyone is trying to figure out, and so. I think my humble opinion is that a lot of community problems are solved in the nonprofit sector. And so this is one of them. Organizations all over the country, including the Tributary, are trying to figure out how can we sustain our democratic infrastructure at the local, state, national level in a different way, because for a very long time, that was sustained through a for-profit enterprise, and it worked great. But now it's not being sustained by for-profit enterprise. And it's not to say that, for-profit newsrooms are not helping with that or not, successful, but it's just at a different level. We did a local study that we can share with you, just looking at the sheer number of journalists in our community has gone down by an astronomical proportion. So I think it's not to say that the nonprofit sector has all the answers, or this is necessarily the way to sustain it. It's just that what we know is that this is a problem and folks are trying to figure it out. And oftentimes that innovation and dealing with market failures, which is what we're seeing here, is something that is solved in the nonprofit sector. Just as we would look at, any other type of nonprofit sector thing that, hey, look, this is a market failure and therefore we're seeing changes. I'll give you, for example, you see that there are nonprofit hospitals, right? There's a reason why some hospitals are for-profit and some hospitals are nonprofit. You see that there's a lot of organizations that maybe have an earned revenue stream, because not all nonprofits are funded solely on donations or solely from government grants. We actually see that a lot of organizations sustain a lot in terms of earned revenue. So it's not to say that any one business model is the only answer to this. It's just hey, let's try something different, because what we've been trying is not getting us the results that we want.
Okay,
and
but
Mike, to your point about like the news deserts, I think it's remembering for each community that they are unique, knowing that some communities can sustain different levels than other communities. And so for, a community, I take Minneapolis as an example, right? Place that has a thriving, news market. The Star Tribune is doing fantastic there. They still have a very large newsroom. They have a large circulation. They seem to be doing well in advertising. That's a market that seems to be able to sustain a for-profit news. Other places that maybe for us, we have a younger populace, we have a lower median income, we have less news readership. And so when you look at the traditional revenue for a for-profit news organization, which is advertising and circulation, and for the Times Union, where the cost of a 7-day-a-week subscription is over $1,000 nowadays, and the advertising here is really dwindling, both because of the retail that is crumbling from JCPenney, Sears, traditional newspaper advertisers, as well as the advertising that's gone to Google and Facebook. So because of that, like looking at what revenue can we bring in from our local community, I thought nonprofit makes sense specifically as a way to go to philanthropists to say, here's the type of work we're able to do, the type of journalism that has impact that we can bring back into the community without trying to hurt the other news organizations by giving this for free to them. We're able to supplement them and maintain them as long as we can while we build out a diverse revenue model. Our revenue right now is donations, but as time goes on, if we can get more earned revenue added in at the same time as, news organizations are hopefully slowing down the decline, then we can start bringing in more and more positions. But that's not our 0 to 60 in 1 year goal, but rather a 10-year goal, something that we can do over time.
Final thoughts. I live in Florida. You live in Florida. We live in Florida. Okay. A very interesting state politically. You must agree, right, Andrew?
Yes.
I mean, it's almost like you sometimes wonder if we're not just some satirical thing happening on Saturday Night Live, correct? Every now and then.
Best place to be a journalist, not necessarily the best place to be a citizen.
You just were integral, correct me if I'm wrong, your newsroom in putting together facts and figures that really showed how redistricting in the Jacksonville area was, I guess you should just, how would you describe it? It was blatantly prejudicial. Do you agree?
Yeah, it was, we were able to demonstrate racial gerrymandering, looking at local redistricting at the city council level. We did both our state redistricting coverage of the legislature as well as the local city council. And I think that's something that's an example of what was missing at a lot of news organizations.
I agree, but of course, then the state Supreme Court shut it down, and it didn't get anywhere. Again, angering. Okay, I'm just getting a little political here now. Remember, we just interviewed on this very program the new afternoon anchor in All Things Considered, and the big challenge in public radio is that it's a white affluent audience. You follow? I mean,
yeah,
that leads to the left. Is that your audience? I mean, that's my final. You're the editor in chief now. You're going to build this puppy for many years to come, Andrew, I assume. And I see passion in you. I see youth. I joked with you before how young you are, and you have a lot more energy than I do. What say you when it comes to being diverse for that community? Because the people that you are reporting and contributing and all that, I don't have the numbers, are likely affluent, educated white folk. May I be so blunt? What are you doing? Actually,
we've been really surprised at our audience. Our donations come from every zip code in our area, and our zip codes are very racially segregated. One is 99% Black or African American in combination with other races. We have our audience, and then the events that we've hosted a number of events, including on redistricting and our coverage of the sheriff. And those events have been about 50% white, 50% non-white, with the majority of that being Black. And we've been really happy with it. We've been really intentional. This is partly, the partnership with the Black newspaper in town, as well as going beyond assuming people are going to just get our news from our website, trying to find other ways to reach people. So one of the things we did was we partnered with local civic organizations to produce flyers that summarized our redistricting reporting so that we could actually hand these out in person to people.
Guerrilla marketing. Yes. You're out there on the streets passing things around.
And in addition to going on the streets or going to senior homes or going to places like that, we also brought them to city council meetings, to public hearings where, hey, there's people gathered here to speak out anyway. And most of them are there because of our reporting. But hey, here's a summary of our reporting to date that they were able to use. And so when we talk about how do you empower citizens, we're not telling people what to say. We are coming at this from an objective lens, but our investigative reporting shows here is the evidence of racial gerrymandering. We show this to people. And so at the legislative level in Tallahassee, there were only a handful of people who spoke. Less than 10 people probably spoke the entire legislature's process until the veto happened by Governor DeSantis. City Council, we had hundreds of people speaking. And we were the ones who were covering that. We were the ones who were driving the interest in local redistricting. And those local groups then turned around, and after the plan was passed, they filed suit in federal court. And that suit is winding its way through. But that suit also depended on repeatedly throughout it, our reporting, what we were able to uncover.
So basically, if I may be so bold, you took a page out of Ken Doctor's playbook, the whole idea where you're supposed to be building a newsroom that not only reports on the news, but is part of the change that follows. Am I correct?
Yes. And I think also recognizing where are people right now. We don't need to rebuild everything. Something nonprofit news organizations, if I could be critical of some of them, would be, I think they sometimes miss that there's already a nonprofit infrastructure that exists in your community. You don't have to reinvent everything. Some things already are there. So using how are people, like nonprofits need to get information to people already. How are they doing that? How can we use the existing pipelines that exist to get information to people? How can we actually work with the community in ways that are already being done now, not having to reinvent everything? Maybe we're reinventing things on the news side, but we don't need to reinvent everything if it already exists from non-news organizations. So using a lot of that to get to people. And I think that's been really helpful. And then again, being aware of where the audience is at. The audience is watching TV, especially diverse audiences. What we see is that TV has a much higher percent of a Black audience than even the community at large, while newspapers and public radio suffer the opposite problem. So we've been really intentional about partnering with TV stations to say, here's investigative reporting that we not just give to you in terms of a story, because they're not going to just read the story, but rather let's work with you on visuals, let's work with you on getting this out there. And that's also been, I think, successful at building a diverse audience.
Deirdre, I'm going to bring one last question to you now. And advice to any frustrated journalist in another community now, since you've helped shepherd this along in Jacksonville. Now, let's assume it's not a Jacksonville. It could be any flavor, any shape. Is this a doable model? Is it easier than some would think? What steps should they take if they are interested in saying, look, I see the whole. I want to continue my passion in journalism. It's not working here in this environment. Can I put together enough funding, enough partners in order to build something that will complement? See, that's what I love about your model. I'm not entering the story, if I may. You don't compete with other media, you complement it. Deirdre, how hard is this for that frustrated journalist, in your opinion?
Thank you, Mike. It's hard. I'm not going to lie to you. Okay. It's hard. I think I work at a nonprofit association. We tell folks all the time, it's not easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. So what I would say is that there are far more resources out there than there used to be for figuring out what's going to work in your community. So I definitely would suggest for anyone who's thinking about this more deeply and really believes in the nonprofit model, which is that news and information is a social good, not necessarily just a product. That there's resources through INN, or of course, they're always welcome to reach out to us. And
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
And you're wearing pretty, this is not your only job at the Tributary.
This is my volunteer gig.
This is your volunteer gig. You actually are the Nonprofit Center of Northeast Florida Senior Director, so Strategic Initiatives. You got a real job, but would you be willing to offer a little coaching, a little advice?
Of course, yeah.
Throughout your email address, Deirdre.
dconner@nonprofitctr.org. And I know that Andrew too would be happy to.
Yeah. Andrew, hold on, Andrew. Same question. that frustrated journalist in the center of the U.S. right now, working for that hedge fund or that downsizing entity? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I'd say this is possible. Jacksonville is not a place that I think a lot of people would think that it's possible to build something like this. And so if you're in, a similar type of place where maybe there's not a lot of philanthropy that stays local, or there's not a lot of obvious audience, it is possible. People want to have a feeling of local ownership over their news. And so if you're able to sell that to them, it also means, part of the challenge is you've got to educate people, which can feel like banging your head against the wall when people really don't understand how dire the news industry is in. People don't understand. We have not done a good job of telling our own story as journalists, partly because it's not always to the benefit of a newspaper company that's trying to get advertisers to buy advertising, to say, hey, we're really struggling. And so we've not really informed the community how bad the problem is. But if you're able to do that work, which is a lot of one-on-one conversations, a lot of thinking through how do you build a broad, diverse base, it is possible. It's been a lot slower than I expected. And, it's something that is probably to our benefit, though, because it's allowing us to build up over time and to build something that's going to last. My goal, and I would say this for anybody else, is that people don't think of this as like Andrew Pantazi's Tributary, but rather this will be an independent organization that can far outlast me. And so how do you, on the front end, build in those kind of institutional roots that will give it the strength it needs?
Wow. Andrew Pantazi, the founding editor of the Jacksonville, Florida Tributary, Deirdre Conner, chairman of the board of the nonprofit entity that is, that runs this growing enterprise. And I want to thank both of you for your valuable time. Anyone is welcome to go to jackstrib.com and check out your content. And by the way, what is your email address, Andrew, if anyone wants to?
Andrew.Pantazi, that's PANTAZI @jackstrib.org.
Both of you stay well, and thanks.
Thank you, Mike.